based on phonics, and I've heard some people, it's Gaillardet, Rick Gaillardet. Rick is military, comes from a military family, so he's been all around. But I think, as I read his biography, a lot of his movement towards being a theologian began in Texas, where he did some parish work, and eventually he ended up in Notre Dame, where he received a doctorate in theology. And then he taught 10 years at St. Thomas and someplace in Texas. I think it was also a seminary. And then he was very fortunate in being invited to Toledo, where I live. And we in Toledo enjoyed his presence for 10 years. He was invited by Jim Basic, another theologian there. And so he's had a very wide experience of dealing with seminarians and students. After he left Toledo, unfortunately, he went to Boston. And he's at Boston College teaching, and he has a traveling theological school. If you look on his website, he's all over the place giving talks. I know I've heard him a couple times out at the Los Angeles Religious Ed Congress. He always draws a big crowd. And he was so popular at our first assembly that people wanted him back. And I kept trying to get him back, but he kept making excuses of one type or another. But we finally got him, and he almost tried to get out of this one, even after he agreed to do it. But we arranged, so he has to catch a plane this evening, but we're glad to have him with us, Dr. Rick Gaillardet.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much. So I'm embarrassed to say that as I was preparing for my reflections, I started thinking about what I spoke about last time I was here. And I discovered that I couldn't remember what I spoke about last time I was here. I couldn't find any documentation about what I spoke about when I was here. A church on, well, thank you, Frank. So I was concerned about this until my wife pointed out that if I couldn't remember, you probably couldn't remember either. So I'm not going to lose any more sleep over that. The subject of my presentation today, and really the theme of your conference, could not be more timely at this moment in our church's life. I have to say that apart from broader questions we have about the clerical sexual abuse crisis and episcopal malfeasance of office and so on and so forth, there are a number of particular things, events that have focused my attention on this particular topic. One of them is that I had the great privilege of co-chairing a seminar sponsored by both our theology department and the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, a 2-year project to explore a theology of the diocesan ministerial priesthood, which ultimately yielded a document titled To Serve the People of God, a document that we feel quite happy about. It was a modest document in some ways, but we think it makes some important contributions, and I'm happy to say that it dovetails quite nicely with the very informative and even visionary document, the white paper that your own association produced. And so my reflections are in part today going to be drawing from my experience of those 2 years of reflection on the theology of the ministerial priesthood. But they've been honed further by a rather provocative article with which many of you are doubtless familiar by James Carroll that appeared in The Atlantic titled To Abolish the Priesthood, or Abolishing the Priesthood. I've always enjoyed James Carroll's writing. I find him to be thought-provoking, generally historically informed, if at times prone to a little rhetorical excess. But I have to confess that I wasn't altogether pleased with this particular article. In fact, it reminded me more than I would have liked of a problematic book that Gary Wills published a few years ago called Why Priests? I want to hasten to point out that I share with James Carroll and Gary Wills much of their frustration about the overall state of our church today and about problems concerning our institution of the hierarchical institution of the church, if we want to use that language, or even problems that are endemic to the priesthood as we experience it today. But I do not share with them the assumption that the priesthood itself as an institution in the church is a problem and that we would do well to kind of abolish it. It seems to me that there are important roles and contributions that the ministerial priesthood plays in the life of the church today that we need to retain, and that there are sources within our great tradition that we need to recover that can serve us well in the renewal of the ministerial priesthood. And so my reflections will be kind of cohere around that set of convictions. In the Council's Decree on Ecumenism, Article 6, it spoke of the need for the church to regularly undergo authentic reform and renewal. And the Council said authentic reform always consists in an increase in fidelity to what the church really is. An increase in fidelity to what the church truly is. And that strikes me as a helpful way of thinking about ecclesial reform. The task of the church is first to explore who are we? What are we to be about? And how can reform help us rediscover our truest and most authentic identity? Now, we can articulate that identity in many ways, and our tradition gives us a plethora of images, and metaphors, and theologies to help us come to a better sense of who we are as a church. Today, given the theme that you've chosen, I want to take just one aspect of the church's authentic self-understanding, that of being a priestly people, and to use that theme to govern our reflections on what a necessary reform and renewal of the church and reform and renewal of the ministerial priesthood might look like. So with that in mind, my presentation will be divided into three parts. First, I want to talk about what does it mean to be a priestly people. Second, what does it mean for the ministerial priesthood to be charged with forming a priestly people? And third, what are the concrete reforms that we need to encourage in the church if we're going to realize the first two? All right? So that'll be the basic structure of my reflections, and then I'll look forward to the fruitful conversation that we'll have afterward. So I want to begin by talking about becoming a priestly people and suggest that we cannot unpack the rich theological significance of this without recognizing, without calling upon the properly subversive understanding of sacrifice and priesthood that are part of our tradition. I say properly subversive because one of the things that we struggle with as a church is that frequently we have imported into our self-understanding problematic notions of sacrifice and priesthood. So anthropologists of religion will point out that most religious traditions at least a primitive stage of their existence have understood sacrifice as something that humans do to appease God, to restore cosmic order, and priests are those charged with accomplishing that. And indeed, biblical scholars will point out that there is an early strata in the Hebrew Scriptures that suggests that at the very beginnings of Israel's existence, it may have had something of that understanding. But they will also point out to us that as Israel grew and developed, and as that testimony grew and developed in the Hebrew Bible, we see a shift away from that notion of sacrifice as appeasing an angry God to more sophisticated understandings of practice, which first of all, sacrifice, which first of all suggest that it is not humans appeasing God, but God working to reconcile and heal God's people. That is at the heart of priesthood and sacrifice. And then when we get to the New Testament, First of all, we must be forthright in recognizing that the language of priesthood is not a primary category for talking about Jesus' ministry. Jesus himself does not use that designation, and in fact, the only places in the New Testament where Jesus is referred to as priest are found in the letter to the Hebrews and the book of Revelation. And yet, even though it was not a central theme in biblical Christology, that does not mean that it is not an illuminating theme, that there aren't elements that it can break open for us about Jesus' life and ministry. But to do that, we're going to have to recognize that Jesus was about subverting conventional understandings of both sacrifice and priesthood. So if we conventionally think of religious sacrifice as something we do in which we sacrifice some victim in order to appease an angry God, Jesus is understood. Jesus presents himself as one who comes among us himself as the vulnerable, forgiving victim that accepts into his very being through his life and ministry the hatred, the sinfulness, the pettiness, the violence of our world, and meets violence and hatred with vulnerable, forgiving love. Which is why some theologians, like the French Sacramento theologian Louis-Marie Chauvet, suggest that if we're going to associate sacrifice with Christ, perhaps we need to speak of it as an ironic sacrifice, or better, he suggests, an anti-sacrifice. A sacrifice that radically upends and subverts our conventional understandings of sacrifice. A sacrifice that breaks open for us the deep logic of creation as one which follows a paschal rhythm of life, death, and new life. And so to the extent that we can characterize Jesus' ministry as both sacrificial and priestly, it has to be wrapped up with the Pauline notion of kenosis, of Jesus' emptying himself of the privileges of divinity in radical solidarity with the human race, out of a belief that in that self-emptying, in that movement from life to death to new life, a paschal logic is disclosed for all who would follow the way of Jesus. Only when we understand Christ's priestly ministry as this initiation into a new logic, a paschal logic defined not by violence and hatred and sacrifice in its conventional sense, but a vulnerable, self-giving love, can we begin to imagine what it might mean for us as God's people to ourselves be a priestly people. And so we move from Christ's priesthood, not to the ministerial priesthood. Indeed, I'm following a logic here that I think has its roots at the Second Vatican Council, where the prime analog for understanding the priesthood is Christ, then the baptismal priesthood, and only third, the ministerial priesthood. And unless we get the first two right, we're bound to misunderstand the third. So we begin with the recognition that while the notion of hieraios does apply to Jesus in a couple of places in the New Testament, nowhere in the New Testament is it ever applied to the church's ministers. Right? Nowhere in the New Testament is it applied to the church's ministers. We do find intriguing testimony, first of all, in 1 Peter 2. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. For once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So that the priestly character of God's people is not, first of all, about something we do, but something that God does in us, right? And then we find in Romans 12, St. Paul writing, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies, yourselves, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Here, Paul is imagining Christian discipleship as having a priestly character, but not primarily a cultic character. For the priestly ministry of God's people is not something done occasionally in the temple. It is the substance of our daily lives. It is a pattern of living. Again, I suggest to you that Paschal logic of life, death, new life. And I want to emphasize, in fact, a little bit more the importance of that, thinking of that grammar as having a three-step movement. One of the things that I think we have learned a great deal from Christian feminist theology is the perils of using sacrificial language, and for that matter, servant language, in the context of a patriarchal church. There is a danger, in other words, of inviting Christians and women in particular, but also other marginalized and oppressed peoples to a spirituality of sacrifice. How do you ask someone who is often treated as a no self or a secondary self to sacrifice, right? And so we recognize that if the Paschal logic is to have any purchase on ordinary men and women who choose to follow Jesus, it must be out of a recognition that in Jesus, the first step is an affirmation of life. Jesus can only enter into that kenotic movement because he knows himself to be loved by God. And so we can never invite people into some sacrificial logic that does not begin with the radical affirmation of their dignity as persons, right? Only out of that sense of our fullness, of our dignity, of our infinite value, can we choose to enter into that movement of death to new life. And so Paul suggests that there's something about our participation in that Paschal movement that is of the very heart of Christian discipleship. So we have Christ's priesthood as an invitation to participate in the paradoxical logic of God's vulnerable, self-giving love. And we move from there to the call of Christians to share in that Paschal movement. So how can we concretize that relationship between Christ's work and ours? Well, here I want to draw on a thought experiment from, I think, one of the most evocative theologians writing today, James Allison. Allison has spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between Christ's priesthood and our baptismal priesthood, and insists that you can't talk about the ministerial priesthood until you get these right. And so to help us understand the relationship between the two, Allison offers a thought experiment associated with the fall of communism. Permit me. He writes, imagine that you are an Albanian living in 1989, and you've just heard over the airwaves that the Berlin Wall has fallen. The evil power, which is the communist regime, has been defeated. Now, the communists may still be in power in Albania, but it doesn't matter much, because you know, and they know you know, that it is all over. And so you begin to celebrate, because you know that the days of the beast are numbered. Now, that does not mean that the state police and party apparatchiks will cease to act as oppressive thugs. On the outside, in fact, everything in Albania may seem as if nothing has changed, when in fact, everything has changed. And you know that it is only a matter of time before the effects of the fall of that distant wall will reach the streets of Albania. And so you begin to celebrate. And perhaps by celebrating, your celebration will even hasten the spread of this decisive defeat in your own land. Allison goes on to say, so it is in the Christian life. Something decisive for the world happened in the Christ event. And by our baptism, we are to live out of that liberating reality of that something which happened in Jesus of Nazareth. We are to live out of that reality. This is the substance of our priestly ministry as God's people. We are to live out of that reality, even if at the level of superficial appearances, nothing appears to have changed. The lives of ordinary Christians are priestly to the extent that we surrender to the power of self-giving, merciful love embodied in the salvific self-gift of Jesus. As Allison provocatively puts it, to live out our baptismal priesthood means being implicated in the beginning of the celebration of a new regime, even while the old regime hasn't yet grasped the news of its own fall. Right? So Allison is suggesting that the heart of a baptismal priesthood is our willingness to live out of the startling reality that in the inbreaking of God's reign in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, all appearances notwithstanding, everything has changed. And we're to live according to that new reality. Only once we've grasped what that fundamental insight about the dynamism of baptismal priesthood is, can we begin to then explore the question, what does it mean for the church to have a ministerial priesthood? Which takes me to the second section of my reflections, to form a priestly people. For I will suggest here that the catechism, actually, it's not all that often that I quote the catechism, but in this case, the catechism wonderfully synthesizes the profoundest intuitions of the Second Vatican Council regarding the nature of the ministerial priesthood. And so we find here in the catechism, while the common priesthood of the faithful is exercised by the unfolding of baptismal grace, a life of faith, hope, and charity, a life according to the Spirit, a life, if you will forgive my gloss, lived according to the paschal logic of life, death, and new life. The ministerial priesthood is wholly at the service of the common priesthood. It is directed at the unfolding of the baptismal grace of all Christians. Right? So with apologies to James Carroll, I want to suggest our task is not to abolish the priesthood. Our task is to redeem, as Frank Clooney put it in a recent article in America, or to reform the priesthood so that it discovers its raison d'etre in the serving of the forming of God's baptismal people. Now, what would that look like? Here I would propose 6 tasks. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that for the purposes of my presentation, and this was a limitation that our seminar, by the way, engaged in, I'm primarily going to be focusing on the diocesan priesthood. I want to recognize that much of what I say here will have some overlap with priesthood that is lived out in religious life. But one of the difficulties, to be perfectly honest with you, is I don't think there's one theology of priesthood. And the moment we get to priesthood as it's lived in religious life, one of the things we have to recognize is there's no one religious form of priesthood, right? So the priesthood as it's lived out, for example, in largely monastic communities, like the Benedictine tradition, is not simply going to be the same as the priesthood exercised, for the example, by the mendicants or by the Jesuits. So while there will be, I hope, a lot of overlap here and some insights that might be of value for thinking about priesthood and religious life. I'm primarily going to be focusing on the priesthood as it's lived in the life of a stable Eucharistic community. All right? So with that in mind, I want to suggest that forming a priestly people requires that we focus on 6 things. First, it requires a more sound theology of the ministerial priesthood than what is frequently being taught and enacted in seminaries and in chanceries in our country, if not in the world. We must first identify problematic features of a distorted theology of priesthood, name them as distortions, if we're then to recover a more sound, a healthier theology of the priesthood. Now, we can revisit a lot of this one later in our discussion. For this point, I'm going to just list some of these and maybe offer a very brief gloss. So first, we must recognize, a privatized account of priestly vocation. That is, there is still a tendency, if you talk to vocations directors in many dioceses and seminaries, for us to imagine the vocation to the priesthood as if it's a private call, something that an individual hears in the deep recesses of their heart, and they are accountable to respond to that call. So there's a sense that I believe I have a vocation to the priesthood, someone might say, right? And the presumption is in favor of my having a vocation to the priesthood, with very little emphasis on the way in which the discernment of that vocation is to be mediated or ought to be mediated by the Christian community. Does that follow? Right? And there are things that flow from that, it seems to me. One of them is that the entire priestly formation process, and we'll talk about this later, often starts with the assumption of the validity of an individual's claim to have a vocation to the priesthood, such that the formative process can easily become a discernment not of a valid vocation or a valid charism for pastoral leadership, but strictly speaking, a negative discernment of impediments, that we're looking to identify problems to weed out. Does that follow? And that follows in part from a too privatized understanding of priestly vocation. Second, we have to identify the difficulties with a theology of the priesthood that makes sacramental character the axis of its theology. Too much of what I would call a bad theology of the priesthood focuses on sacramental character. Right? Now, let me be very clear, not just because this is being recorded. I have no objection to the church's teaching that a sacramental character is conferred on priesthood. I would point out to you how incredibly modest the church's teaching is on this. In the Middle Ages, stemming from the time of Thomas Aquinas up through Duns Scotus, there was in fact a very lively disputation about what precisely priestly sacramental character looked like. And there were widely varying understandings of what that sacramental character looked like. Interestingly, when we get to the Council of Trent's teaching, it expressly refuses to give a positive account of what sacramental character looks like. It says very briefly that baptism, confirmation, and holy orders confer a sacramental character such that none of those sacraments may be repeated. And that's it. Now, I'm not saying that there have not been subsequent theologies. Indeed, I will suggest from the 17th century on, one of the difficulties is a massive theoretical superstructure was imposed on that very modest teaching. So particularly the French school of spirituality in the 17th century, associated with Jean-Jacques Ollier and the Sulpicians and some of those other schools that were dedicated to the reform of the priesthood, built a superstructure on the notion of sacramental character that emphasized, for example, that intrinsic to that sacramental character is the priest becoming an alter Christus, another Christ. And what we see from that period on is a massive sacralizing of ordained ministry that I think is deeply problematic. And by the way, not required by our doctrinal commitments. Closely related, this sacralizes the priest as an alter Christus, Right? Makes of the priest another Christ. I'm going to talk about this in a moment. It is striking that Vatican II never uses the phrase alter Christus in its discussion of the priesthood. It makes celibacy, and I'm not here to bash celibacy at all, but it makes celibacy an essential, virtually ontological feature of priesthood. And I should point out how recent that is. So Paul VI, Sacerdotalis Celibatus, and John Paul II's Pastores Dabo Vobis both treat celibacy not just as a value, but almost as intrinsic to the Christological character of the priesthood, even as they reluctantly recognize the existence of married priests already in the church, primarily in Eastern Catholic churches. The problem here, I want to add, and I'll come back to later, is not celibacy. It's celibacy is an essential quasi-ontological feature of priesthood. Next, a theology that focuses on ordination primarily in terms of the conferral of powers. So what makes a deacon are the powers the deacon has that a layperson didn't have. What makes a priest are the additional powers the priest is given to confect the Eucharist, to absolve. What makes a bishop are the additional powers that the bishop has to ordain, and so on and so forth. I will suggest to you that a theology of the priesthood that starts with the conferral of powers is only going to get us going down the wrong road. And then finally, a problematic theology of orders fails to properly correlate, as I've tried to set up our reflections today, the ministerial priesthood in relation to the baptismal priesthood. All right. So if this first move has to do with identifying problematic features of a bad theology of the priesthood, the second part of this first move is what are key features in a sound theology of the ministerial priesthood? And I've already given you kind of a nod in this direction. First is to recover a properly ecclesial account of priestly vocation. That it is the task of the whole people of God to discern the gifts, the aptitudes, and the charisms that may warrant calling a candidate forth to presbyteral ministry. But that the church should be involved in that discernment at every step of the way. I'll return to that in the final section. Secondly, that ordination effects an ecclesial repositioning. There's a wonderful theologian named James Puglisi who's been teaching for 20 or 30 years in Rome who did a massive 3-volume study of ordination rituals in our tradition. And one of the things he concludes when he looks at the ordination rituals of the West for the first millennium is that there was never a sense that ordination simply confers powers on an individual ordinand. Rather, the sense was always that ordination draws one into a new ecclesial relationship. There is implicit, in other words, a kind of notion of ontological change, though we have freighted that with a lot of speculative baggage. But the change is ecclesial in character, right? And this starts with a notion that if we're going to use the language of sacramental character, we shouldn't be starting with priesthood, we should be starting with baptism. And the recognition that baptism constitutes not a private relationship with God, but constitutes my primal identity as a follower of Jesus. To be baptized is to be brought into a decisive relationship among the people of God. And only when I appreciate that, as the Orthodox theologian John Zizioulas puts it, there's no such thing as a non-ordained person, Zizioulas provocatively says. He says you can't understand ministerial ordination if you don't get that baptism and chrismation is the primordial ordination that draws all God's people into a relationship that changes them at the very core of their being. Once we recognize that it is baptism that affects an ecclesial belonging that shapes who we are, can we begin to see that some small number from among God's people will be called into a new ecclesial relationship to serve the baptismal priesthood, right? Related to that, then, is the sense that there is indeed an empowerment that occurs in ordination, but it is not the privatized notion of empowerment where a bishop lays hands on the ordinand and they're zapped with powers they didn't have 10 minutes ago. Right? The empowerment follows upon an ecclesial repositioning. In other words, it is because through ordination you are called to be for us in a new way that the Spirit empowers you to do what that new relationship requires. Does that make sense? So there is a genuine empowerment, and I can translate this in the classical language about confecting the Eucharist and absolving sins, but I would insist that its better understanding is not that you get this power and then decide what you're going to do with it, but you're ordained into God's service and empowered to do what that relationship requires. So again, it makes the relationship to God's people decisive in its theology. And then it follows the insight of Vatican II, which never used the static language of alter Christus, but instead suggested that the priest acts dynamically in persona Christi capitis, which is a language that, by the way, is not without its difficulties, I would admit, but was a tremendous step forward because it was intended to be more dynamic. Right? All of us are called to act and live out of our baptism in persona Christi. All this suggests is that some among us are called to a ministry of pastoral leadership, language of headship, configured, by the way, to Christ's headship as one who came not to be served, but to serve, one who came not to have his feet washed, but to wash the feet of others. We can return to that a little bit later. So if the first feature in imagining or reimagining what it is to think of the ministerial priesthood in terms of the obligation to form a priestly people, the second requires a clearer sense of authentic pastoral leadership. Most early church scholars recognize that if we go back to the very beginnings of the documentary evidence that we have in support of an ordained ministry of pastoral leadership, we recognize that what most churches did is they looked around and they said, who is the de facto leader of this community? And they ordained them to exercise that, so that their presidential sacramental leadership proceeded from their pastoral leadership. So I'm arguing that there is a ministry of pastoral leadership that is integral to this. But what does that pastoral leadership look like? It requires, first of all, that we have, those who are called to this, a clear grasp of what it is that we are leading people into. That if we're called to lead a local community, it begs the question, why? Why should anyone want to be a part of this community? And may I suggest that at this moment in our history and of the church, that question needs to be preeminent. You can't ask about pastoral leadership until you say pastoral leadership into what and for what purpose. One of the ironies of the Second Vatican Council for pastoral ministry was, in my view, it was too successful in one key way. Prior to the Second Vatican Council, one of the principal reasons why people were told they needed to be part of the church was the Cyprian maxim outside the church, there's no salvation. That is to say, you need to be part of the church because if you're not part of the church, your salvation is in peril. Well, the Second Vatican Council, as you all know, kind of effectively undermined that by recognizing the genuine reality that grace and truth can be encountered not just outside the Roman Catholic Church, but outside of Christianity. That salvation is available for people outside the church. By the way, I think that move was entirely appropriate and necessary. But it undercut one of the most basic reasons to join the Christian community, right? Hope of salvation. We embraced the council's move to a salvific optimism, but we continued frequently a pastoral practice that presumed the older model. In other words, a kind of pastoral complacency was allowed to set in, where we didn't do the hard work of saying, is there another reason to say to people today, here's why you ought to be part of this community, apart from fear of salvation? And I believe we need a lot more work to be done, particularly at this moment when I don't need to tell you the growing number, the outrageously large number of millennials and others who simply don't find a compelling argument to be part of our community. So a pastoral leadership committed to forming a priestly people needs a vision of a community that's compelling. I've increasingly been moved by the theology of not a Catholic theologian, but a Reformed theologian, James K.A. Smith, who has written a very provocative trilogy on liturgy and belonging in the church. And he proposes what he calls a liturgical anthropology. He says we need to recover an anthropology. He's unabashed, by the way, in his indebtedness to the early church and to Augustine and others. He says we need a different anthropology for ecclesial belonging. We can't start with the notion of the human as thinker, as if we're going to win people over by simply making better intellectual arguments against, for example, atheism. This is why I share the view of Michael Sean Winters that Bishop Barron, who I admire in many ways, is a very provocative and intelligent and engaging thinker in the church, has perhaps too much confidence in the fact that we've got better arguments than atheists. I think he's right, by the way. I'm just not convinced that's what's going to have people banging on our doors to come back. All right? So it cannot be the starting point of the human person as thinker, nor does Smith believe it can be the human person as believer, where we argue for the intrinsic superiority of our doctrines. He says we must begin with the human person as lover. We must begin with the idea that we come to the church as a school that offers a pedagogy of desire, that offers to shape our love, our worship. He recognizes the question is never in our culture whether to worship. Following Augustine, he recognizes the only question is what or whom will we worship? To live is to set our heart on something. And the question, Smith says, is whether we will be schooled in our heart's longings according to the patterns and practices of consumerism, or will we offer a different pedagogy? Will we present ourselves as a community where you can be formed in the way of love, in the kind of priestly living that is about learning to embrace the pattern of Christ's self-giving love as the deepest logic in our daily lives? The second thing I would say about a renewed sense of authentic pastoral leadership is that authentic pastoral leadership requires the exercise of authority. Authority's gotten a bad name today, understandably so. Both the terms power and authority, when we use those terms anymore, they're almost synonymous with our sense of everything that's wrong in the church. But we need to understand that authority actually plays an essential role in the life of the church, and that authority is never really something that one has. Authority always resides in a relationship, right? In other words, I have no more authority over you than what you grant to me, right? I mean, you ultimately decide whether I have anything to offer at all, right? And the same thing with my students. Now, admittedly, I can force them to take tests, and they have to kind of nominally nod to my authority in a kind of juridical way because they're going to get a grade from me. But they ultimately have to grant me authority for me to be an effective teacher. And I have to grant them an authority in a different sense, right? So we need to think about authority in more productive ways. And here I want to draw on the work of the French political theorist and atomist Yves Simon, who says when we look at the exercise of authority, we need to recognize that there are two different kinds of authority that work. And the problem, if I will, this is my gloss, is what should be the secondary form of authority has too often become the primary form in our church. So he speaks of substitutionary authority, which is an exceptional form of authority that substitutes for the incapacity of others. And his example would be a parent's exercise of authority. So when I exercise my authority over my children in sort of this apodictic way, so you will not cross the street when you're playing outside, I substitute for the fact that they are not yet able to discern for themselves the boundaries of their play area. Does that make sense? And in limited circumstances, we would say law enforcement sometimes has to exercise substitutionary authority when dealing, for example, with a criminal who shows no evidence of honoring the concerns and values and rights of others. The difficulty is that the exceptional form of substitutionary authority too often becomes, in law enforcement and in parenting, when we fail to recognize when we're parenting teenagers or young adults that we can't exercise authority as we did when they were 5. Law enforcement who can't recognize that the use of force and coercion is only rarely to be invoked in last resort, but they normalize it, right? And in the church where we make juridical exercise of authority the norm when it ought to be a matter of last resort. Rather, he says the normal exercise of authority within any community is what he calls a habitual exercise, or what I've called a facilitative exercise. And the classic example for this is that of the authority of a symphony conductor, in which he says, look, if you look at a symphony, every musician in the orchestra, or in the symphony, every musician is concerned with the common good of the entire orchestra. Everyone is. They all want the orchestra to perform a particular piece well. So he would say they are formally concerned with the common good of the entire orchestra. But materially, concretely, they want to play their particular piece of music as best they can. Does that follow? So every musician wants the whole performance of the orchestra to do well. That's their formal commitment to the common good. But materially, they want to make the most of their particular gift. The conductor, he says, is both formally concerned with the common good and materially concerned with it, right? And so when a conductor exercises her authority well, she is not suppressing the gifts of the individual musicians. She is in fact exercising an authority in a way that maximizes the gifts of the individual musicians for a common purpose. Does that follow? Now, it turns out the Second Vatican Council, I believe, had something very similar to that in mind when it talked about the authority of presbyters and pastors. And so we find in Apostolicam Actuositatem, Articles 2 and 3, that's the decree of the apostle of the laity, Presbyterorum Ordinis, Article 9, Lumen Gentium, Article 12, in all of those places, we see pastors enjoined not to suppress the Spirit, but to learn to identify the gifts of God's people and to call them forth, to empower them, to order them for the common good. What the council is in fact invoking is the priority of a habitual rather than a substitutionary exercise of authority. And so just as one example, we can look at the decree on priestly ministry and life. While testing the spirits to discover if they be of God, they, presbyters, must discover with faith, recognize with joy, and foster diligently the many and varied charismatic gifts of the laity, whether these be of a humble or more exalted kind. Priests should confidently entrust to the laity duties in the service of the church, giving them freedom and opportunity for activity, and even inviting them, when opportunity offers, to undertake projects on their own initiative. So this suggests that authentic presbyteral authority, at least in the context of a local and stable Eucharistic community, is that habitual exercise of authority that aims to bring about the flourishing of the whole people by celebrating, empowering, and ordering their gifts. A third feature of the responsibility of the ministerial priesthood to form a priestly people requires a commitment to synodality. If we were to take one word to name the leitmotif of this papacy, it would be synodality. Pope Francis made a quite original contribution to contemporary Catholic ecclesiology with his appropriation of this term, which, by the way, is not used in the way he uses it at the Second Vatican Council. This constitutes, it seems to me, a genuine reception and development of something the council was teaching. Because Francis, even when he offered his first theological reflection on synodality, he did so on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Episcopal Synod by Pope Paul VI in Apostolica Solicitudo. But Francis, when he gave his speech celebrating the creation of Episcopal synods while a synod was in session, actually said very little about Episcopal synods. Rather, he spoke of synodality as pertaining to the very heart of what the church is about. And he breaks it down etymologically to speak of synodos as walking together, as a church that learns to listen to one another, right? And he enjoins the church at every level of church life to be synodal in character. At the level of parishes and dioceses and episcopal conferences and synods and in the Roman Curia, as we're going to discover in the Apostolic Constitution about to come out on the reform of the Curia. At every level of church life, he enjoins church leaders to be committed to listening. Now, fair enough. I mean, who's not a fan of listening? Who's not a fan of consultation? I have to tell you, I have never met a bishop or seminary rector or religious superior or pastor or university president or department chair who didn't think they were consultative. Never, not once. We're all consultative. We're all consultative. Pope Francis, however, is the first pope to point out that it doesn't matter one lick if you only consult the people you know are going to agree with you. And so in Evangelii Gaudium, he makes a point of saying to bishops, and when you consult people, you have to create a space to listen to people who are going to disagree with you, right? And in so many ways, Francis has modeled this, it seems to me. Now, one of the ways, were I to get any time alone with Pope Francis, I would love to invite him to begin to invite some Christian feminist theologians and consult them, because he might learn something about some notions of feminism and gender theory about which, sadly, I think he's simply ill-informed. But that's a topic for another day. To be an effective priest, forming a priestly people, means being committed to synodality. To asking yourself, what are the ways in which I am inviting people to speak in my parish? How are bishops doing that? One of the most underutilized canons in the Code of Canon Law, by the way, is the canon that requires a bishop or his proxy to visit every parish in his diocese over a 5-year period. There is incredible ecclesiological potential in that particular canon, in my view. If a bishop understood that not to be fulfilled by going to a confirmation, but instead made it his responsibility to visit every parish and to announce an open mic session in the parish hall in which he would not say anything but a brief welcome and then would sit in a chair and simply listen to whoever came. Or if a pastor provided an opportunity to do the same thing. This is a commitment to synodality, entirely in keeping with the Second Vatican Council's conviction that the whole people of God possess a gift, a supernatural instinct, the sensus fidei, to hear God's word, to penetrate its meaning more profoundly, to apply it more comprehensively in their lives. If we believe what the Council teaches in Dei Verbum 8 and Lumen Gentium 12 about that, then how can you not see listening as not just politically correct or a savvy, pragmatic exercise, but as essential to what it is to be a pastoral leader today? Fourth, to form a priestly people requires a renewed commitment to liturgical preaching. I'm increasingly of the view that one of the long-standing struggles in our church today regarding liturgical preaching is that we have become accustomed to offering eloquent answers to questions no one's asking. And the council understood that. The council understood that. I'm reminded I spent 10 years teaching at the Diocesan Seminary in Houston, Texas, and regularly I would go out and talk in parishes, and people would come up to me, and they'd be frustrated with some of the young priests that were coming out of the 70s. This is in the 90s, so most of you are exempt here, right? But they were complaining about some of the young priests coming out of the seminary in the 90s. And they would say, what are you teaching them about preaching? And we would go back and we would have a faculty meeting and we'd decide, we need to add another course in biblical exegesis. Or we need to add another course in homiletics, because that's an academic solution to everything, is just add a new course and we'll cover the problem. But I'm not convinced that the crisis of liturgical preaching is about oratorical technique. I think the Second Vatican Council puts its finger on it when it writes in Presbyterorum Ordinis 4, priestly preaching is often very difficult in the circumstances of the modern world. This is my point about offering answers to questions no one's asking. In order that it might more effectively move men and women's minds, the Word of God ought not to be explained in a general and abstract way, but rather by applying the lasting truth of the gospel to the particular circumstances of life. And it's that last phrase, as a layperson, that I'm pleading with you to consider. To the particular circumstances of life. The ultimate litmus test of effective preaching is, did I hear anything that forces me to look at my life in its concreteness in a new way, right? That forces me to consider the daily circumstances of my life with fresh eyes. If I'm merely entertained or amused or inspired in some abstract spiritual way, but it doesn't invite me to concretely seek out transformation, it has not done what liturgical preaching is supposed to do. To form the people of God requires effective, authentic liturgical presidency. And this really flows from everything that we're talking about. I must tell you, I think there is, how do I want to say this? I think there is a danger sometimes on the part of progressive presbyters in our church today, who are rightly, I want to emphasize this, rightly sensitized to the dangers of clericalism and want to commit themselves to not being clerical, that mistakenly assumes that that means a quasi-apologetic approach to liturgical presidency. And I would invite you to consider that most of God's people aren't nearly as concerned as you are about that particular thing. They want you to draw them into the Eucharistic life of the church. And that means effective liturgical presiding that neither makes oneself the center of attention in a kind of informal talk show host style or an overly sacral form, or doesn't trust the power of the ritual to do its work, but simply presides in a way that invites God's people to allow the symbols and rituals and narratives to do their work. Right? And that takes care and attention, it seems to me. It also requires, and this is closely related to the question of liturgical preaching, that we think about what this presidency is about, what this Eucharistic celebration is about. I've always been taken with Karl Rahner's reflection on the fundamental relationship between what he calls the liturgy of the church and the liturgy of the world. What the Eastern Orthodox theologian Ion Bria refers to as the divine liturgy, the great liturgy, and the liturgy after the liturgy, which is the transformation of the world more and more in service of God's reign. And so we need to recognize that authentic liturgical preaching is always, presiding is always gathering to send, right? Gathering to send out in mission. finally, authentic ministry and service of forming a priestly people requires compassionate pastoral care. Just a brief word about this, and then I'm going to conclude with some suggestions for reform. Using this notion of forming a priestly people as our framework for thinking about pastoral care reminds me of Victor Hugo's novel and the famous musical Les Miserables. Right? I'd love to recount the whole thing, but we don't have time to do that. But I want to remind you, I'm suspecting, how many of you have seen at least the musical? Yeah, all right. I want to remind you about the two characters, the two principal characters in the musical. The novel actually does a lot of different things here, but we'll stick with the musical because it's more straightforward. You've got two characters, right? Valjean and Javert. And Valjean, we know, emerges from 20 years of prison. He's let loose. He's hungry. He's cold. And a bishop meets him. And a bishop offers him the comfort of his own home. And Valjean takes advantage of that hospitality, steals some silver candlesticks, sneaks out in the night, is captured, is brought back to the bishop by the police. The bishop, of course, insists on his innocence, tells him to take more of what had been offered. And essentially, as the police leave, invites him to go and accept this gift to become an honest man. And may I suggest to you that is at the very heart of what it is to encourage priestly living. The bishop is embodying the humble, self-giving love of Christ to Valjean and saying, take the gift and make that logic of self-giving love the deep logic of your life, which of course we know he does in ways great and small, right? Until we encounter the second character, a complicated character, right? Javert, who represents a certain take on the gospel focused much more on law and order and obedience and judgment. And complicated circumstances bring about a plot switch where instead of Javert chasing Valjean, he's put into Valjean's disposal. And Valjean has the opportunity to execute him, right? To exact revenge, but he doesn't. He frees him. And in the musical, of course, Javert can't accept the gift. He can't move into that logic of vulnerable, self-giving love because it would require a conversion, right? There is something powerful in that particular story about what it is to form a priestly people, in which the bishop and Valjean, cleric and layperson, both internalize the logic of priestly living that allows ourselves to be shaped by God's vulnerable, self-giving love and to live our lives that way and to affect others. That is the kind of ministry that serves the formation of God's people. So I've gone longer than I was supposed to, so I want to lead with a few things that I'm hoping we can come back to when we have some table discussion and so on. But I briefly want to suggest if this is a valid vision of the necessity of a renewed ministerial priesthood that plays a vital role in service of God's people, becoming priestly, in imitation of the radical, subversive priesthood of Christ, then what are some things that we're going to have to do differently? Well, I've suggested a few of them. First of all, we're going to need to facilitate a shift in the way we think about our local Christian communities. The South African bishop, Fritz Lobinger, an important figure that we might want to come back to later because of the inspiration he's had on Pope Francis, suggests that the key for reimagining the priesthood, and he has in his back of his mind, of course, the notion of ordaining married men, that's the little carrot here, is that we can only do that if we first have communities that no longer look to the priest to provide for them. So it means shifting from a provided for model of community to a community as a symphony of charisms. We can't reform the priesthood as long as the priest is the provider of the community. Right? And again, there's so much more for us to talk about there. Second, we have to reconsider the way we call forth candidates for the priesthood. It is no longer sufficient, if it ever was, to focus on the personal holiness of a candidate. Holiness is a necessary, but altogether insufficient criterion for becoming a priest. We must, as Pope John Paul II emphasized, focus as well not just on spiritual formation, but on human formation. And in our particular context, we must pay far more attention than we have in the past to calling forth people who are not just holy and prayerful, but psychosexually mature. Right? We must reconsider the current context and processes for priestly formation. Your own white paper and the document that emerged from our seminar to serve the people of God highlighted the importance of this and called into question, at least for a diocesan priesthood, the wisdom of forming priests in a quasi-monastic setting and asking how can we prepare people who have little experience during their seminary formation doing laundry, shopping, paying bills, cooking, to understand the pressing needs of the people that they're to form as a priestly people. How can we move away from what happened as a result of the last apostolic visitation, this strong emphasis on separating seminarians from the rest of God's people, and recognize a more healthy model which understands that we can assess their adequacy for ministry and enrich their preparedness by making sure throughout their formative process they are in regular contact with God's people. And is the time ripe for us to even radically consider the possibility that seminarians might benefit from spending a far more significant amount of time while doing seminary studies living in communities associated with local parishes, right? Where they're much more immersed in the communities that they will serve for the rest of their ministry. And then finally, we must reconsider how we look at the pool of candidates for the priesthood. This is going to be at the top of it won't be at the top, but it will be a significant piece in the agenda of the upcoming Amazonian Synod in October. Can we as a church listen to the Spirit and discover ways in which the pool of candidates for presbyteral ministry can be enlarged without denigrating the role of celibacy as a valuable tradition in the church, but seeing the possible contributions of viri probati, of mature married men, and has the time come for the church to at least begin to open itself up to the impulse of the Spirit and ask whether new insights about the role of women and our understanding of gender and sexuality might invite us to hear the Spirit moving us in new ways. These are difficult questions, they're controversial questions, but it's difficult to avoid them in our current situation. And so I suggest to you in closing that my focus this evening has simply been on the theme of your entire conference, the ancient insight regarding the priesthood of the faithful, oriented towards redressing long-standing and unfortunate imbalance. I've invited us to consider that the baptized do not define themselves only in relation to the ordained. Rather, ordained ministry and the sacraments of the church exist for no other purpose than to serve the priestly life of the baptized. This is the true meaning of becoming an adult church, recognizing that it is the priestly life of the baptized that is central. That we are, as baptized followers of Jesus, called to be signs to the world that something has happened in Christ. That Jesus has indeed thrown the world out of balance. And it is we who are the true priests. And as such, without denigrating the necessary and valuable role of the ordained, all of the baptized are called to partake of the priestly ministry of Christ and transform our lives so that the world in which we live may see in us the puzzling, the paradoxical, the beguiling face of vulnerable, forgiving love that once hung on the cross and now risen offers hope for a broken and suffering world. Thank you.